Creating box shadows manually sucks. So in this video, we're going to create a website that allows us to visually create box shadows instead of having to manually create them. So let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now to get started, I have the final version of our project on the right, and you can see when I update any of these numbers, this box shadow is actually updating based on all of our different values. We can even modify the color, for example, of the shadow or of the box, or we can even change the background color if we see fit, so we have complete customization over what our shadow looks like. And now to get started, I just have a blank project open in Visual Studio Code, and we're going to need to create first an HTML page, then a CSS page, and then lastly we're going to need some form of JavaScript, so we're going to also need a script here. So let's get started with the HTML because this is going to be the easiest thing, and if we just hit exclamation point enter, generates all the boilerplate for us, and we can link in our style sheet, which is styles.css, and we're also going to link in our script tag, which is script.js, and we're just going to make sure to defer this so it loads after the rest of our body content. Also, let's just give this a title here. We're just going to call it box shadow GUI, just like that. And now in the body, we can get working on creating the elements we're going to need to create this UI on the right. The first thing that we're obviously going to need is a square for our box, and we're just going to give that an ID of box. So now we have a div with an ID of box, which is going to represent our box in the middle. And in order to get this box to be centered inside of our screen, we're going to wrap it inside of a container. So we're going to use a box container class div, and we're going to put the box inside of that div. This is so that we can easily center this using Flexbox later. The next thing we're going to need is this sidebar. So let's create a sidebar. And if you're confused how I'm creating classes by just typing a period and then hitting enter, I have an entire video on that topic, which you can find in the cards and the description down below. Now to continue on with our sidebar, inside of here we have a bunch of different labels and inputs, and we also have this divider line. So let's get started first by adding in a label, and this label is going to be for our X position, and it's just going to have the label of X. Then we're going to have an input, which is going to be a number input, which is going to have a name of X position, and it's going to have an ID of X position. Now we're going to have to copy this down a bunch of additional times, so let's just copy this label and this position, and we're going to do the same thing, but this is going to be for our Y position. It's going to have a label here of Y, and the name and the ID are both going to be Y position. Next, we're going to do another input here. This one is going to be for our blur. So let's just make sure we change this to be for our blur. Our label is blur. Whoops, not blue, blur. And our name and our ID are all going to be the exact same of blur, just like that. Let's copy this down again. We're going to do this for spread. Make sure this says spread here. And there we go, we have our spread value done. And the next thing we can work on is our actual color. So we're going to have another label here. This one's going to be for shadow. It's going to have a label of shadow. And what we're going to do inside of this label here, we're going to have a input, which is going to be a type of color. And that gives us that nice color picker that you saw on the right-hand side when we click on this fancy color picker. That's by using type of color. And we're going to set this name to be shadow color and the ID to be shadow color. And we're also going to make sure our for is also shadow color. Now let's copy that down 2 more times because we're going to have our box color. And this is just going to say here, box, and make sure we replace all these shadows with box color. And again, up here, we're going to have background color. Let's just move this down below our box so that it's easier to work with. There we go. So this here is going to be our background. And let's make sure that we change this to background. Change this to background color, and also this one to background color. And now if we open this up with Live Server, over on the right hand side here, you'll see it pop up in just a little bit. You see we have our X, Y, all of our different inputs, as well as our different color pickers. So everything is showing up there by default. Obviously our box is not showing up because it's just an empty div right now. And we don't actually have any width or height inside that. The last thing we have left to do is add in this horizontal line. We're just going to create a div called divider. And that divider div is what's going to represent this horizontal line here, which divides our top and bottom content. This top section is all for the box shadow, and this bottom section is extra things such as the color of our box and the color of our background. And that's all of our HTML for now that we're going to need. So let's actually jump into styling this HTML. The first thing that I want to get started with is just to change our box sizing on every element to be border box. Makes working with our widths and heights much easier. And then in our body, let's remove all of our margin, set that to 0, and then work on how we're actually going to lay out our box and our sidebar. We're going to use Flexbox to do that, so they'll be side by side next to each other. So we're going to change this to a display of flex, and we're also going to make sure that the minimum height is going to be set to 100 view height. That just ensures that our body is going to take up 100% of the height, which will make centering this box much easier later on. So now that we have that done, you see our margins were removed on our body, which is great. The next thing that we're going to work on is actually pushing our sidebar over to the side and building out our box. So we have our box container, and we're going to have our sidebar here. And our box container, we want to fill up as much available space as possible. So we're going to set this to flex grow of 1. And as you can see right now, nothing happens because there's no additional space horizontally. So on our sidebar, let's set a minimum width here, which is just going to be 120 or 130 pixels, sorry. And we're also going to set a actual width of 20%. And the reason we're setting both of our different widths is that the smallest we ever want this to be is 130 pixels, while if our screen size is very large, for example like this, we want it to take up a full 20% of the screen so it doesn't look too small on the side of our screen. But when it's really small, we only want it to take up 130 pixels. So now with that out of the way, we can see that our box container is taking up all of this extra remaining space here. In order to actually visualize our box, let's select that box, which we know has an ID of box, and give it some width and height. We're just going to say maybe 100 pixels of width and height. And we're going to change the background color to just be red for now. That'll be really easy to see. And as you can see, we have that nice red square. In order to center it, like I said, we're going to use display of flex. And we're going to justify our content in the center, and we're going to align our items in the center, and that's going to put our box dead center inside of our screen between our sidebar and the top and bottom of our screen. I also want to give our box a little bit of a margin. We'll just say a margin of 25 pixels on all sides. That way, if our screen size does shrink down, it never becomes so small that our box is not able to have a border around it. We want to be able to show that box shadow, so we want to have a little bit of space around our box even if our screen size is really small. So now the next thing we want to work on is changing over our font family, because right now the default font kind of looks ugly, so we'll just use Arial as our font. It looks a little bit better. And now we want to work on styling out this sidebar, because our body of our box content is fine for now, but we need to work on this sidebar because it's pretty ugly right now. So the first thing I want to do is change it over to use Flexbox, and this is because if we change the flex direction to column, we're able to stack everything on top of each other. As you can see, every single input is stacked right on top of each other, which is really, really nice. Also, it prevents our inputs from becoming too wide, because without this flex direction, you can see we have really long inputs that go all the way to the edge of our screen. But if we make sure we use Flexbox, you can see that scroll bar is no longer there because our inputs actually stop right on the edge of our screen. Lastly, for this sidebar, let's add a little bit of padding. We'll do 0.5 rem top bottom and 1 rem on the left and right. Give it a little bit of space. And we'll also change the background color, and we're just going to make this a really dark color. Just 222 looks pretty good. And we'll change our color to white so that we can actually see the text inside of here. And already this looks much better and pretty similar to what we have over here. All we have left to do is actually focus on styling our inputs and our spacing, and we're pretty much there with our styling. In order to space our elements out, let's select our labels from our sidebar. So we'll say sidebar label. So every single label that's going to be X, Y, and so on. What we want to do is add some margin on the top. We'll do 0.75 rem. And we're also going to add a little bit of margin on the bottom of 0.15 rem. That way we have our actual inputs spaced out from one another, and the label is just slightly offset from the actual input, just giving it a little bit more space, which looks good in my opinion. Also, we're going to want to set our font weight here to be bold. That way these labels really stick out so that we know that they're clickable. Now the next thing to do is work on this divider. If you remember, we created an element in our HTML with a class of divider, so we can actually just select that divider. by saying divider. And all we want to do is give some space around this. So we're going to use margin. We're going to say we want 1 rem to be on the top. We want -1 rem on the left. And the reason for this is that we have this padding of 1 rem and we need to offset that. If we were to have 0 here, I'll show you what that looks like in just a little bit. But on the bottom, we're going to have 0.5 rem. And on the left, we're also going to have -1 rem. But for now, I'll show you what that looks like with 0. And then we're just going to use a border for this. So we'll say border bottom is going to be 1 pixel solid. And we're going to set this color here to be 999. And if I save, you can see we get that divider. But as I mentioned, it's 1 rem away from the edge on both sides because of this padding. So what we want to do is make sure that we have here our -1 rem of margin, which is going to push this all the way up to the edge of both of these sides. And the reason we have a different margin on the top than we have on the bottom is because of the margin top and margin bottom that you see on our label. We have 0.75 here and 0.15 here, which is a 0.6 difference. So actually, this should be 0.4 rem on the bottom like that. So that way we have an even amount of space between the top portion of our divider and the bottom portion of our divider. Now with all of that spacing done, let's work on styling our inputs. And we're going to first style our number inputs and then style our color inputs because they're obviously going to look quite a bit different. So let's select our inputs, and we want to select the ones that are not color inputs first. So we're going to say not type equal to color, just like that. So this is going to select every input that's not a color input, which in our case is these 4 number inputs. And what we want to do here is we want to add a little bit of padding onto these. We'll do 0.25 em and 0.5 em just to give our numbers some breathing room inside of here. And also you'll notice our font is different. So we want to make sure that our font family is going to inherit and our font size is going to inherit. And that way our inputs have the exact same font and font size as the rest of our application. And that already is starting to look better. Now the next thing that we want to work on is going to be our border. We're actually going to completely remove the border, but instead of saying border none here, what we're actually going to say is 1 pixel solid transparent. And the reason for that is that in our input focus state, so our input not type equal to color of focus, what we're going to do is actually change our border color to be this OAF color. So now when we select it, we get that OAF color. But if we were to set our border to none here and we select, we're not going to get that OAF color going around as we would expect, especially if we turn off our outline to none, which is what we're going to do. You'll see that we don't get that blue color at all. But when we have our border set to 1 pixel solid transparent, we actually do get that 1 pixel of space, and our blue border is able to show up when we click on our element, which is really good. Next, we're going to set our border radius, which we're just going to use 0.3 em just to give it a little bit of a rounded corner. And now when we click, you can see that looks really good. And that's everything to styling these number inputs. So let's go on to styling our input that is going to be our color input. So we'll say input type equal color, color, just like that. And inside of here, the first thing I want to do is just set the width to be 100%, so it stretches the full width just like the rest of our inputs do. And I want to use that same border radius of 0.3 em, just like that. That looks pretty good. And we're going to change our background color here to be white, just so that we have the same background color for our inputs as that we do for our color inputs. Lastly, I want to remove the border from this, so we'll set the border to be equal to none, and I'm also going to change the cursor to pointer, just so it's really obvious that you can click on these to change the color. And as you can see, everything is working correctly. Now we can actually move on to the JavaScript portion of this and how we're going to link everything together, because that's the most important part of this application. And in my opinion, the easiest way for us to link all of this together is to use CSS variables. So if you remember in our HTML, we have this name property, and we set this name property to shadow color, box color, background color, spread, so on. And we're actually going to name CSS variables after the name property of each one of these different inputs. So what's going to happen in our JavaScript is we're going to set a bunch of variables on our root element, and then we're going to be able to use those inside of, for example, our box. So here we can use a background color variable to set our background color. But by default, this background color variable is going to be blank. So we actually need to put a placeholder value inside of here. And we're just going to use a placeholder value here of FFD700. This is going to give us that yellowy color. And let's just make sure we copy this placeholder and put this placeholder here into our background color property as the value. So we're going to set the value here equal to that. And as you can see, our default background color in our input is going to be the exact same as the background color of our actual box. And this is just so our different inputs are going to be linked up at the beginning, because when our page loads, we want to make sure our inputs and our display are exactly the same, even before our JavaScript starts working. Now the next thing we need to do is be able to set all of the different box shadow properties on our box. So let's use box shadow here, and we're going to just put this onto a new line because this is going to be a quite large explanation here. The first thing we're going to do is our X position. So we have a variable, which we're going to call X position. And by default, let's just set that to 3. And we need to convert this value of 3 to pixels. So we're just going to say calc 3 times 1 pixel. And what this does is it converts this value of 3 here, or whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, 10, 200, and it multiplies it by 1 pixel, which converts that value to pixels. We can do the exact same thing, but for our Y position, which will also just default to 3 for now. We also need to make sure that we set our blur. So let's just copy this down, set our blur, and we're going to just default this to 5. We'll copy this down one more time for our spread. Let's just default this to 6, for example. And now if we save, you can see we get this nice box shadow over here, which has all of these default values set. But our inputs do not have these defaults. So inside of our input, let's make sure we set our default values. This one is going to be 3. Our Y position has the exact same default, so let's copy that over. Our blur, if you remember, has a default value of 5. And our spread here is going to have a default value of 6. So now our default inputs line up with our actual color here. Also, we need to make sure we include our color in here. So we're just going to do our var, which is going to be shadow color, just like that. And our default value for this is just going to be 0, 0, 0. It's going to be black. So now inside of here, let's make sure we set the default value for our shadow color to be in here to be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And that's going to just make sure this default value is black. Also, we're going to want to do our default value for our background, and it looks like I actually put the value for our box color on the background input. So let's make sure that's in the right spot. There we go. And let's do the default value here for our background, which is just going to be 0 or FFF for a white color. Now, if we jump over into our styles, the last thing we have left to do is to come into our box container and set the background color to be based on our background color variable, and it's going to default to that white color of FFF. And as you can see, everything is looking how we want it to, and we can finally move on to the JavaScript so that we can change these variables. And if you remember right, in this index.html, every single variable corresponds with their name property of that input. So now in our script, let's actually select all of our different inputs. We can say document.querySelector all, and we want to select all of the inputs, and we want to loop through each one to add an event listener for whenever they change. So for each one of our inputs, what we want to do is take that input and add an event listener, which is going to be on the input event. Essentially, every single time we make any change at all, this event is going to be fired. And we're just going to call a function which is going to be called input changed. So let's create that function. Function input changed. And this is going to take in the event. And what we want to do is select our document and document. And we want to get the root element. So we just say document element. We want to access the style because this is where we can actually modify the CSS. And we're going to call a function called setProperty. And inside of this function, we need to pass it our property name, which is going to be e.target.name. This name, for example, is going to be shadow color, like this. But we need to make sure that we have 2 extra dashes in front of this name. So to do that, we can put 2 dashes, and then inside of there, we can have our target name, and then we can finish that off. And we're just using temperate literals for this. So we use this backtick symbol, as well as this $sign with the curly brackets to put a variable inside of our string. So this is going to convert our name to a name with 2 hyphens in front of it. And we want to set that to our e.target.value. This is just whatever value is inside of our box here. And now when we save and we modify our X value, you see that moves. We modify our Y, it moves. If we modify our blur, you can see it gets more blurry. And our spread is going to make it more spread out. Let's make sure all of these work. So we'll change our shadow here, change that color, do our box to green, and we notice our box did not work. So let's see what's wrong. If we go into our index.html, we have our name set to box color. And in our style sheet, let's see what we have on our box. We used a background color here. So let's make sure we set this to box color. And now you can see that green color was properly applied to our box. Lastly, let's change our background. We'll change it to this color here, and you can see our background has updated. So all of our different variables are now linked up, and all we have is just these few lines of JavaScript because we smartly used the name property of our input to determine which variable in our CSS we were going to modify. And that's all it takes to create this really useful visual tool. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out some of my other projects linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.